Thank you for being here. I'm Flavio Bonfiglio Sorans, and Head of Practice of Software Security, also Managing Principal at Foregenix. I'm part of the Council's Secure Software Task Force and the Mobile Task Force as well. And I have done several assessments in PCI Secure Software Standard and Secure SLC Standard since the framework's publication back in 2020.
Okay. Buenas tardes a todos. Thank you everybody for joining today. My name is Carlos Marquez. I have been with Foregenix for a few years now, and during this time I have been pen testing a number of applications, and we have had the opportunity to interact either with application hardware and the infrastructure below them, and we have learned about different kind of implementations, different development practices that have been implemented during the process. So we want to bring with you some of the experience that we got during those assessments and different products that we have tested.
All right, so the topics that we're going to cover today are, initially, we will perform an overview of the Secure Software Standard, and we'll also cover some differences between the traditional application pen testing and the specific PCI Secure Software Standard testing.
Also, we are going to talk about what should be prepared before of a technical assessment, and also we are going to go through the security tests that are performed. Also, we are going to talk about the common findings that we have found during those assessments and try to bring some recommendations in order to address those common findings that we have seen in the wild.
So let's start with a brief overview of the PCI Secure Software Standard. So the PCI Software Security Framework consists of two standards, actually two independent programs, each of which contains one standard, also independent, and independent validation processes.
All right, and usually for define an application, some question can be able to describe an application. Usually is what data is considered sensitive. Remember that there are several kinds of sensitive data. We are going to talk about that later on. Also, we are going to identify how this sensitive data is flowing across the application. And finally, with sensitive resources, with resources that actually interact or impact the security of this sensitive data are involved into the application itself. So all these elements are defined into the framework, considered into the framework, and this is a good way to learn about how the application is built and structured.
All right, so at the core of the standard, we have to identify all data that requires protection. And this is defined in the PCI SSF glossary as sensitive data, which is not only payment data. So then we'll have to identify all payment software functionality that has the ability basically to impact sensitive data or that provides security features. And sometimes the payment functionality also interacts with sensitive resources. But what are those sensitive resources? Well, sensitive resources are external to the payment software, but required by it to make a complete system. Remember, a sensitive resource can also be sensitive data. For example, a configuration file that sits in the operating system that may contain an encryption key that's used by the software. One thing that was introduced in the PCI Secure Software Standard is modularization. So we have 12 core requirements, and then, depending on the particularities of the software, we'll have function modules or platform modules. All right, so the 12 core requirements apply to every type of payment software, disregarding functionality or type. If the software handles account data, of course, it will require to be validated against Module A. If the software is designed to run on a PTS device, it will cover Module B. And if the software facilitates electronic payments transactions over the internet, then it will have to be validated against model C. All right, now that we have seen this standard overview, let's continue with their particularities. For example, under the standard, the payment software is expected to be secure and resilient by itself, because it's not expected to run necessarily on a PCI DSS environment.
So now we are going to talk about the differences between an application, a traditional application pen test, and the secure software standard testing. So basically, during an application penetration test, usually the scope is limited to the application itself. While in a software security standard test, the application is evaluated along with additional surrounding components, including the backend system, including, for example, cloud components that may be required to the operation of the application. Also, in this kind of test, the assessor will need to have access to dynamic or static interaction with the application, so maybe checking the results of DAS or SAS reports is necessary. Also, checking reports of vulnerabilities, scans, or application or infrastructure previous penetration reports is definitely necessary. And one key difference between the secure software standard test and the penetration testing is also that the assessor requires access to the documentation information, the technical documentation, the installation guide. And usually this information is not provided to a pen tester in the case of an application pen test.
Right. So then, Carlos, how can we prepare to the technical assessment?
Okay, the preparations may be different depending on the role of the stakeholder that is part of the project. So we are going to see different points or different points of view depending on the role of the key part involved in the assessment. There we are. So initially, from the point of view of the software, of the owner of the software, it's important to identify the scope of the assessment, what it means, identify what is the sensitive data again, how this data flows across the application. Also identify which roles are required to be tested, very important, because remember that from the point of view of a test, you cannot test what you cannot see. So maybe a role has more access than any other different role. Also to identify all the surrounding components that are along the application itself.
Right, and as you mentioned, the stakeholder point of view is key for the preparation. And another thing that the software vendor has to prepare before the assessment is to have a good identification of the particularities of the environment where the software is going to be executed. For example, the operating systems, the databases, or other components that will be dependencies. And also to understand completely the implications of the technical installation of the software, as well as understanding the architecture and communications and network connectivity that is required for the software to run. Of course, there are also other, sorry, no worries. There are also other relevant cases, for example, in a cloud-based scenario where the responsibility matrix of that cloud is also relevant for the vendor to prepare before the assessment.
Okay, so before we have seen some of the relevant aspects that should be prepared from the software owner or the software vendor. Now we are going to see the role of the auditor. So part of the assessment, again, checking the scope itself is relevant. Identify what is the testing scenario. Is it going to be a production scenario? Is it going to be a testing scenario? It definitely impacts what kind of tests are going to be able to be performed. Also, it's important to identify which requiring connectivity need to be set in order to access to the application, which credentials needs to be required, which API keys eventually, or which user password, multiple factor authentication needs to be provided in order to be able to interact with the software. Also identify which attack vectors can be executed and make sure that these attack vectors can be actually implemented in the execution environment. Those are considerations for the auditor.
All right, so while performing the PCI secure software tests, we have identified some common issues based on real-world scenarios that I would like to share with you.
All right. So there are different phases that we can see during a normal security test as part of the standard. Usually, we start with an information gathering, then a source code review, then there is a practical validation of the installation process, also production test. This is when we interact with the application itself, and something very particular, which is post-mortem test, like a forensic review of the application itself and the digital information. So, starting with the security test, in the information gathering phase, it's relevant to understand what is the architecture of the application, basically following the control objective 1 of the standard, and define which and how these tests are going to be performed. In the second phase, we are going to check about or to interact with the software in order to force it to deal with unexpected conditions in a way that the application capabilities and also the attack surface of the application is going to be mapped and identified clearly. Usually, it includes a deep review of the different technical components of the application, how it behaves regarding handling sensitive data. Remember that sensitive data, in this case, is not only payment information. It may be only any privileged information, credentials, sensitive technical information that is relevant or critical for the operation of the application itself, and multiple technical interaction with the application at that point. Okay, usually during the source code review particularly, we have find a common issue regarding with the use of the possibility to extract sensitive data from the source code or from the components of the application. In this case, usually we have found that identifying a security memory deletion process is not easy. It's honestly challenging sometimes, and the interaction between different components of the application is complex because you need to share a token, a privileged token, eventually an API key, or a privilege into the architecture of the application. So sharing this kind of information is usually sensitive and critical.
Right, and back to that slide, sometimes we find that passwords are hard-coded in the source code while performing those source code analysis. And this is an opportunity for secrets management tools to handle those in order to prevent those sort of leakage of sensitive data within the source code.
Yes, indeed.
So now in the installation process, it's also paramount to test it completely, to follow that process as we were actually the ones that are consuming the software. And the way to do that is by using and following step-by-step the software vendor implementation guidance, which is in core requirement 12. So validation of that process will require to fully review and install it on all the different dependencies, hardware and software dependencies. And also to understand and have well written the default configurations that are going to be used or modified. Also scripts, assigned permissions, configuration files, and how those processes work together in order to, again, make the complete system of the software work.
All right. Usually we have observed during the installation process the use of a third-party software is usually affected by default configuration or maybe default credentials. For example, as we see on the screen, a component that is listening in all interfaces of a system. This kind of misconfigurations are usually a common finding.
Yeah, this is quite classic, and I don't remember how many times we have found web management consoles of Tomcat on port 8080 or JBoss port 9990. And we have seen that several times, right?
Yeah, definitely we have seen that many times. Also, as part of the installation processes, we have found as a common issue that command line interfaces or bash script usually as part of the installation process, it leaves some traces in the host once the application is installed. So we often have identified that the lack of a housekeeping process to clean up after the installation has been a missing activity that may be used to enhance the security there.
Right, yeah. Okay, so during software execution, validation of all security features are performed in a testing environment. But this testing environment has to fully simulate a real-world use of that particular payment software. So common findings in this phase are quite similar to what we usually find in web application penetration testing and infrastructure penetration testing.
Right. Also, in the post-mortem test, when we apply some forensic techniques in order to be able to review the memory or the disk data as a way to identify or reveal potential sensitive information leaks, has some challenges. Usually, the technical challenge that are usually a challenge for the assessor itself involves the required privilege that the auditor needs to have in the execution environment. For example, to be able to make a process dump, to be able to make a capture of the image of the disk where the information is running. So considering, again, the privilege and the availability of the debugging tools in the execution environment is something that is quite important to be considered, of course, during the assessment or prior to the assessment as well.
All right, so to wrap it up, remember, identifying and documenting all relevant payment software information prior to the assessment is key for the success of the validation process.
And based in the test that we have performed across multiple applications, we usually suggest, and we have learned that we should suggest, to put a special attention in the secure integration with third-party components, with third-party components of the software, particularly make some effort with the hardening, not for the application itself, but also the components that support the operation in the backend as well. Also, we had found weaknesses in the secret management, so implement a proper secret management. Definitely remove the use of plain text configuration files. It's definitely something that needs to be enforced as part of a good practice to develop secure payment application. And it's good from the point of view of the software vendor, implement a cleanup process after the installation of the application, or even from the point of view of the software user, the end customer, make sure that the environments are clear from sensitive data after the installation. Those are practices that we have learned across testing different environments.
Yeah, like a housekeeping process.
Indeed, right. Absolutely necessary, and not always present.
All right, so that was it, right?
That was it.
Yeah. So thank you for being here. I know you might be wanting to go to lunch. So we're in booth 18. Feel free to come and have a conversation with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.